Now on the record in the case of State of Iowa versus Kelsie Ray Thomas, case FECR 011664. This is day 2, a defendant's bench trial. Defendant is personally present in the courtroom. Counsel are all present. The state has not yet rested. The court understands that may occur momentarily after a stipulation is read into the record and the state has a few more exhibits to offer. Once the state has rested, we will proceed with defendant's case. Go ahead, Mr. Neff.
Ms. Hughes will be handling this matter, Your Honor.
Go ahead, Ms. Hughes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, there are several stipulations between the parties that I know we started addressing in the last court date, and we have put them in a written stipulation that the state will mark as exhibit number 111 and offer that as an exhibit and file that. And Judge, I would just like to read that because it entails all of the stipulations that the state and defense agree.
Go ahead.
Comes now the state of Iowa through Wapello County Attorney Reuben Neff and Assistant Attorney General Maureen Hughes, along with defense counsel Alan Cook and Nicole Jensen, and notify this honorable court of the following evidentiary stipulations in this matter. The state and defense, in lieu of calling certain witnesses, ask this honorable court to accept transcripts of the following witnesses. 1. Caladra Cookout, State's Exhibit 91. 2. Brittany Johnson, State's Exhibit 92. 3. Corey Benji, State's Exhibit 93. 4. Scott Adams, State's Exhibit 94. 5. Blake Leffler, State's Exhibit 95. 6. Tom McAndrew, State's Exhibit 96. 7. Aaron Thomas, State's Exhibit 97. 8. Amanda Messenick, State's Exhibit 98. 9. Dr. Catalier Expert Qualification Testimony, State's Exhibit 101. 10. Jill Gardner, State's Exhibit 102. And 11. Dr. Brian Cutler, PhD, State's Exhibit 103. The state and defense stipulate to the admission of the following. 1. Audio recording made on July 20th, 2018, capturing discussions between Brittany Johnson and Kelsie Thomas. The defense and state agree that this honorable court should disregard hearsay statements referenced in the said recording. This recording is State's Exhibit 99. 2. Video recording made on July 24th, 2018 of Aaron Thomas's interview by investigator Scott Adams, specifically the time frame between 3:08 p.m. to 3:10 p.m. concerning hearsay statements made by Aaron Thomas about Cloe Chandler's behavior at daycare. They are not to be considered for the truth of the matter asserted, but instead to aid this honorable court in understanding the dynamic in the Thomas household by providing context. This recording is State's Exhibit 100. 3. Department of Criminal Investigations transcription of law enforcement interviews of Kelsie Thomas, dated July 24th, 2018 and July 26th, 2018. Both parties also stipulate that the original transcription contains one mistake. In the transcript on the July 26th interview, on line 10450 of page 240, the transcript notes, quote, yeah, end quote, when the correct transcription would be, quote, no, end quote. These exhibits are State's Exhibits 104 and 105. 4. Video recordings containing interviews of Kelsie Thomas from July 24th, 2018 and July 26th, 2018. The defense and state agree that this honorable court should disregard the polygraph test and results and any references that relate to the subject matter. The recordings from the July 24th, 2018 interview are contained on a thumb drive marked as State's Exhibit 106, and the state's recordings from the July 26th, 2018 interview are contained on a thumb drive marked as State's Exhibit 107. 5. Audio recording containing the 911 call made by Kelsie Thomas on July 19th, 2018 This recording is on a disc and is marked as State's Exhibit 108. And 6, an audio recording of two separate jail intake calls made by Kelsie Thomas on July 26, 2018 at 19:10 hours and 19:26 hours. Each of these recordings are on a separate disc and are marked as State's Exhibit 109 and 110. Judge, I believe that's stipulated by both parties.
Mr. Cook, have you had a chance to review that stipulation?
I have, Your Honor.
And do you agree with it?
I do.
Okay. The court notes that counsel have agreed to a stipulation between them. Many of the exhibits referred to don't match up with the exhibits that I've got on EDMS. And so before I accept that stipulation, I'm going to need to verify what's going on with those exhibits. Also, several of the exhibits referred to, I simply don't have. They're tangible thumb drives, I guess. I don't have them. But once I've got all of the exhibits that were referred to, then at that point I intend to accept the party stipulation. So with the court's reservation about the stipulation, does the state rest?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. State rests, except for the stipulation. We'll deal with that later. And go ahead, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, the defense will call Dr. Thomas Young.
Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that what you're about to do is true and correct? So help you God.
Yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please state your name.
My name is Thomas Young.
And, sir, what is your profession?
I am a forensic pathologist.
Sir, do you hold any board certifications?
I do.
And what are those?
I am certified by the American Board of Pathology in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology.
Sir, where are you currently employed?
I am self-employed in Kansas City, Missouri.
And what is the name of your business?
Heartland Forensic Pathology, LLC.
And how long have you been running Heartland Forensic Pathology, LLC?
More than 13 years now.
What kind of services do you provide at Heartland Forensic?
I provide forensic pathology services. Much of the time it involves consultation in forensic matters. Lately it's also involved work, actually doing medical examiner work in West Virginia, and also serving as a laboratory director.
And where is it that you're currently serving as laboratory director?
It's in the Putnam County Memorial Hospital in northern Missouri.
And you said that you engage there in general pathology practice?
That's a what you would call a clinical pathology practice. I basically serve as a medical director for a hospital clinical laboratory.
Okay. And can you tell the court generally what that entails?
It involves studying the quality control for the ongoing months there in the laboratory, and also approving any kind of instrument validation for bringing new instruments online in the laboratory.
Dr. Young, do you have a current resume or curriculum vitae?
I do.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Okay.
Dr. Young, I'm going to hand you what I've previously had admitted as defense exhibit I-2. You recognize that document?
Yes.
And what is it?
Defendant's Exhibit I-2 is a copy of my curriculum vitae.
And generally speaking, does that document list your academic and professional accomplishments throughout your career?
Yes, sir.
Do you believe all the information contained in your CV is accurate?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, at this time I would, well, it's already been admitted, right? I strike that, Your Honor. Dr. Young, can you tell the court about your experience and how you became a forensic pathologist beginning from medical school?
Following medical school, I performed a residency in anatomic and clinical pathology, which is basically pathology applied to the patient care hospital setting. I did that for 4 years. Then I went on active duty in the United States Air Force for 3.5 years as a hospital pathologist. Following that, I traveled to Atlanta, Georgia, did a fellowship in forensic pathology for 1 year. This was from 1988 to 1989. I remained in Atlanta for another 7 years as an associate medical examiner for the Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office in Atlanta, and also served as a medical examiner for the Division of Forensic Sciences, Georgia Bureau of Investigation. In 1995, I accepted the position of Chief Medical Examiner in Jackson County, Missouri, remaining there for another 12 years, almost.
And in reviewing your CV, Dr. Young, it appears that you've worn a few different professional hats at the same time throughout your career, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had mentioned while serving as a medical examiner for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, you were simultaneously serving as Associate Medical Examiner for Fulton County in Atlanta, correct?
Correct.
And while you were doing that, you're also teaching pathology to medical students at Emory University of Medicine, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And likewise, after you moved to Missouri, where you were the Chief Medical Examiner for Jackson County in Kansas City, you were simultaneously serving as Platte County, Clay County, and Cass County at various times throughout that period of time, correct?
Correct.
Dr. Young, is it correct to say that you've been engaged in forensic pathology full-time since 1988?
Yes.
Has there ever been any time in your career since 1988 in which you faced disciplinary matters, a censure, been founded or faced any disciplinary measures, a censure, whether founded or unfounded, anything like that at all?
No.
And again, based on your CV, would it be correct that from the beginning of your career in 1988 until 2006, you worked as a forensic pathologist for one form of government entity or another, whether that be military, federal, or state, correct?
Correct.
And in those capacities, you would be doing similar work to any other state medical examiner or associate medical examiner in conducting autopsies, things of that nature, correct?
Correct.
Dr. Young, have you authored any books or articles in the area of forensic pathology?
Yes, sir.
And would those publications be outlined in your CV as well?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, at this time I would ask the court to recognize Dr. Thomas Young as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
Dr. Young will be recognized as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
Dr. Young, can you tell the court when it was that the defense team for Kelsie Thomas first reached out to you in this case?
If I could refer to my notes.
Certainly.
I was first notified about this in December 5, 2019.
And what services were you asked to perform at that time?
I was asked to view the discovery, including the autopsy report on Cloe Chandler and other documents having to do with the investigation of the case.
Okay, and we'll go over that here in a minute. What is your hourly rate?
$450 per hour.
And are you billing at your standard hourly rate in this case?
Yes, sir.
In the course of your consultation work as a forensic pathologist, have you ever been approached by a defense attorney like myself and asked to perform a case review, but ultimately your findings were not what the defense attorney was hoping for?
That's happened, yes.
just because the defense team is paying for your services doesn't mean that we're paying for your opinion. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement.
As part of your analysis, Dr. Young, can you outline for the court all the materials that you reviewed in coming to your opinion?
I viewed documents from the Iowa Office of the State Medical Examiner, including the autopsy report of Cloe Chandler. I viewed the neuropathology report from UI Diagnostic Laboratories, the heart examination report from the Jesse Edwards Registry for Cardiovascular Disease, a deposition transcript of Dr. Michelle Catalier, reports from the Division of Criminal Investigation, the pre-hospital care report, the Iowa Incident Report, records from All Ages Pediatrics PC, reports from the Ottumwa Police Department, photographs of the autopsy, and I have also looked at some additional transcripts of testimony from Dr. Catalier and viewed other photographs as well.
Back in December of 2019, after concluding your review, what did you do?
I was asked to write a report.
Did you also compile notes that are in reference to that report?
Pardon me?
Did you also compile some notes regarding that report?
Yes, sir.
Do you have your letter and notes available to you today?
Yes, sir.
Based on your review, were you able to come to an opinion on the cause of death of Cloe Chandler?
I have an opinion as to what the cause of death is in Cloe Chandler, yes.
And what is your opinion?
Cause of death is hanging.
And Dr. Young, one of the documents you reviewed, I believe you testified to, was Dr. Catalier's autopsy report, correct?
Yes, sir.
So is it fair to say that you were in disagreement with Dr. Catalier's opinion that the cause of death of Cloe Chandler was manual strangulation?
Yes, sir.
And before we get into that detail, Dr. Young, do you disagree with Dr. Catalier's autopsy report in its entirety, or just her ultimate opinion that this was a manual strangulation?
I'm in agreement with what she saw at the autopsy, what she described in the report, and what she photographed. I'm in complete agreement with that. The only difference here is the conclusion.
So would it be accurate to say that you, in forming your opinion, were relying on Dr. Catalier's own observations and measurements?
Yes, sir.
As part of your review of the history of the case, Dr. Young, were you aware that Kelsie Thomas initially reported having found Cloe Chandler hanging in a closet, that she took her down out of the closet and contacted emergency responders?
I'm aware of that.
Generally speaking, was the history provided by Kelsie Thomas and other witnesses at the time of autopsy consistent with the hanging, in your opinion?
Yes.
Were there any inconsistencies that you could identify?
No.
As part of your review of the history of this case, Dr. Young, were you aware that Kelsie Thomas ultimately confessed to strangling her daughter, Cloe Chandler?
Yes, sir.
And again, did you find that Kelsie Thomas's ultimate confession was consistent with Dr. Catalier's medical findings at autopsy?
No, sir.
All right, Dr. Young, what I want to do is I want to go through some autopsy photographs and ask you some questions about those. All right, Dr. Young, we have here displayed State's Exhibit 56, which has been previously admitted. Can you tell us what your observations are here?
State's Exhibit 56 shows the child's, the front of her neck and a little bit of the right side of her neck. There's a band of redness with intermittent streaks of paleness. That band of redness is about 3/4 of an inch in width. Extending on the right front side of that area of redness is another area which is narrower, looking to be about 1/4 of an inch in width. It extends upward as it passes from front to back and passes behind the auricle of the right ear.
Is this injury or is this redness, is there a medical term for that?
Well, if there is actual hemorrhage, then it would be essentially a bruise. If it's just redness, it would be what you would call erythema, which is a Latinized way of saying redness.
Okay. You had mentioned that this picture depicts some areas of faintness or pallor. Is that
Yes.
correct? And does that demonstrate anything to you?
That they're just simply areas of pallor.
If those areas of pallor were previously described as consistent with finger marks, does that appear consistent with you?
Sure.
Is it accurate to say that those could be finger marks or those could not be finger marks?
That is accurate.
Can you say so with any degree of scientific certainty?
No.
Within those areas of pallor, it's been described the small red nicks that are a little bit more pronounced could in fact be fingernail scratches. Do you disagree with that?
It could be.
Could they also be something else?
Correct.
There's also been testimony, Dr. Young, that the ligature mark could indicate that the ligature that made contact with Cloe Chandler's neck was twisted in some way. Does that appear consistent?
It could be, yes.
We're going to move on, Doctor, to State's Exhibit number 57. Can you tell the court what you see here?
State's Exhibit 57 shows more of the right front and right side of the child's neck. The what appears to be an abrasion that is band-like that extends basically upward from front to back can be seen more readily in this photograph.
And is that sometimes described as an upwardly canted furrow mark?
Yes.
And as a forensic pathologist, what does your experience and the literature say about an upwardly canted furrow mark?
In a situation where the decedent is suspended from something that is above the head, typically the mark that is formed by the ligature is going to be upwardly canted when it goes from front to back.
Are there furrow marks that exist in manual strangulation cases?
Well, it's hard to say about, in general, all manual strangulation cases because every case is different.
Okay.
So I hesitate to answer that categorically.
Okay, well, let me rephrase my question. In strangulation cases where there is a furrow mark, what is it that you often see in those situations?
In a situation where there may be a ligature strangulation, where a rope or a cable or some kind of an object is used to throttle the person, typically the furrow that is formed or the scrapes that are formed are going to be in the transverse plane, not canted upward as it goes from front to back.
And doctor, just so the court's clear, what do you mean by transverse?
Transverse basically means horizontal to the ground when the person is standing in the upright position.
And so therefore not upwardly canted?
Correct.
Given the mechanics of a strangulation, would an upward cant to the ligature be less efficient than a transverse ligature?
I don't recall seeing any cases in which there's been a ligature strangulation where you would have that kind of upward canting. Guessing about whether or not it would be efficient or not is not something that I could properly say.
Okay. We're going to move on to exhibit number 58. What are your observations of State's exhibit number 58, Doctor?
State's exhibit number 58 is also a photograph of the front side of the child's neck and also a little bit more of the left front aspect of the neck.
Okay. And State's exhibit number 59?
State's exhibit number 59 is showing the front side of the child's neck and a little bit of the right front aspect of the neck.
And Dr. Young, if the court has heard testimony that State's exhibit number 59 has some depictions of nail scratches in this photograph, do you believe that that's accurate?
There are some short segmented line-like marks, and I'm not sure if these are scrapes or whether it's just simply redness, but they can be seen in the photograph, basically to the left of center in the photograph.
Would it be accurate that these may or may not be, in fact, finger scratch or finger nail impressions?
That would be accurate.
We'll move on to State's exhibit 60. And of note here, Dr. Young, there's been testimony about the abrasions in the ligature furrow itself. Do you have any observations about that?
Okay, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Okay. Let me ask you this way, Dr. Young. Is abrasion in a ligature furrow common?
Yes, it is.
What would be necessary to create an abrasion in a ligature furrow?
Simply either rubbing or pressed contact of the ligature against the skin sufficient to damage the surface cells of the skin.
Is a sort of rubbing friction necessary to produce those marks?
No.
State's exhibit number 61. Can you tell the court what is depicted here?
State's exhibit 61 shows the left side of the child's neck. It shows the areas of erythema and pallor that can be seen in the front of the neck, but also as that erythema upwardly cants when moving from front to back, there is also a pale furrow that extends upwardly as it passes behind the left ear.
And referring back to State's Exhibit number 58, which showed the left side of Cloe Chandler's neck, what are your observations to the fact that in Exhibit 58, the left side shows a much more prominent ligature furrow behind Cloe Chandler's left ear, and in State's Exhibit 61 shown here, there is a much less prominent furrow. Does that inform your analysis at all?
Okay, I believe State's Exhibit 58 showed the right side of the neck, not the left.
Okay, and I think I did swap those out, so you are correct.
Okay, the right side of the neck, the mark is more prominent and it looks more abraded than it does on the left side of the neck. There could be several reasons for it. One of them is that there is basically more pressure on the ligature against the neck on the right side than it was on the left side.
Does the fact that the ligature mark is more prominent on one side or the other dictate to you that this would not have been a hanging?
No.
And why not?
It just doesn't. I don't know that I can explain why not.
Okay. Is it a common finding in a hanging that the ligature furrow would be more prominent on one side as opposed to the other?
It is often seen.
And is there any, I know that forensic doctors don't actually see people dying necessarily. Is there any theory as to why it would be more prominent on one side or the other?
Well, even though we might not necessarily see the person dying, we frequently see the position of the person at the time of death, usually when they're suspended or hanging. And a lot of times you can see from the position of the body and the way the head is tilted and the way the body is positioned that there could be more pressure of one side of the ligature on the neck than on the other.
And so if in this case the court received evidence that when Cloe Chandler was found hanging in that closet that her neck and her head were down to one side, based on your experience and expertise, would that account for the difference in the litigation furrow from the left side to the right side as depicted in State's Exhibits 58 and 61?
That is consistent.
Moving on, Doctor, to State's Exhibit number 62. Can you tell the court what's depicted here?
State's Exhibit 62 shows the child's back, upper back, the back side of the child's neck, and also the child's scalp. The hair is pushed up. In the center of the photograph, there is a transverse mark that appears that it could be some kind of a furrow or some other kind of mark.
Okay. If the court has received testimony opining that that ligature mark that exists on the back, or that mark, I should say, that exists on the back of Cloe Chandler's neck as depicted in State's Exhibit 62 is an autopsy artifact, is that a possibility?
Sure.
Are there other possibilities?
Sure.
And moving on, Doctor, to State's Exhibit number 63. Can you tell the court what is being depicted here?
State's Exhibit 63 is a photograph of the lower aspect of the child's face, including the nose and the lip. A pair of forceps is used to grasp the lower lip and to reflect it in order to basically show the filmy lining or mucosa of the lower lip. There is what appears to be an area where it's a little bit more tan on that vermilion border on the lower lip a little bit to the right side, although it is kind of faint. Otherwise, I don't see any injury.
Is it possible that there's a faint injury here?
Sure, it's possible.
And would those abrasions be consistent with injuries that could have resulted during intubation?
Sure.
State's Exhibit number 64. Can you tell the court what is depicted here?
State's Exhibit 64 shows the child's face. The left side of the upper lip is grasped with a pair of forceps and pulled upward. This shows a little bit of the mucosa there in the left upper lip.
And while it may be faint, is it possible there's a faint injury here as well?
It's possible, but I don't see it.
And could that type of faint injury be caused by intubation?
Sure.
State's Exhibit number 65 is essentially an identifying photograph of Cloe Chandler for purpose of autopsy. Do you have any observations about this picture that you believe are relevant?
It appears that an autopsy has already been performed by the time this photograph is taken, because you can see the, or it doesn't necessarily mean autopsy. There could have also been organ donation. But some kind of incision that's closed with string is on the right side of the photograph. The child's face doesn't show any visible injury.
If Cloe Chandler were in fact a victim of manual strangulation, are there evidences of manual strangulation that you do not see here?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Sure.
When you're saying evidences that I do not see, I'm not clear on what you mean.
Do you observe any facial petechiae in this photograph?
I can't see any, no.
Would you expect to see any in a manual strangulation?
Frequently in any kind of a strangulation, petechiae are common.
We're going to move on to State's Exhibit number 67. Can you tell the court what you observe here?
State's Exhibit 67 shows the left side of the child's face, including the ear, the left shoulder, and a portion of the left side of the neck. There is a apparent furrow, a ligature furrow, that is extending upward or counted upward as it passes from front to back.
In your experience, Dr. Young, can you observe an upwardly canted ligature furrow on both sides of the neck in hanging deaths?
Sure.
And so Cloe Chandler's presentation would be consistent with that?
Okay, what do you mean by presentation?
What you have observed of Cloe Chandler would be consistent as far as a hanging death in which the ligature marks are upwardly canted on both sides?
Having upwardly canted ligature marks is consistent with a hanging. It's typically what is seen, because usually the item from which the person is hanging from is above the head. So it makes the furrow and the mark upwardly canted.
And you would expect to see that on both sides?
That's frequently the case.
State's Exhibit number 69. What does this exhibit show us, Doctor?
State's Exhibit 69 shows the front portion of the scalp reflected. The child's bony skull is seen on the right side of the photograph, and the inner lining of the deep scalp is seen in the middle and toward the left side of the photograph. Within the generally yellow-orange background of the deep scalp, there are patches of hemorrhage that are noted on both sides of the midline of this deep scalp.
The hemorrhages that you see depicted in the scalp, Doctor, are those always caused by trauma?
They're not always caused by trauma.
Is it possible for these types of hemorrhages to appear after death?
Yes.
And could a person also present these types of hemorrhages in other asphyxiation type of deaths?
Yes.
So it's not specific to a manual strangulation death?
That is correct.
Moving on, Doctor, to State's Exhibit 70. Can you tell the court what is depicted in this exhibit?
State's Exhibit 70 shows what we would refer to as a neck dissection. The flap of skin and underlying tissue is on the right side of the photograph. And so the head would be, if you were to continue to the right on the photograph, you would be going to the head. On the left side is some previous dissection that was going on below the neck. So this is apparently a situation in which the neck has been, where the skin has been reflected upward, and it is exposing strap muscles of the neck, as well as the sternocleidomastoid muscles, which are big, broad muscles that go on either side of the front of the neck. There are multiple plastic white arrows in there, and they are showing or pointing to these little areas of hemorrhage that are in the strap muscles and on the left sternocleidomastoid muscle.
Could these types of hemorrhages be caused by intubation?
Sure.
Could these types of hemorrhages be caused by other resuscitation efforts being made during life-saving measures?
Sure.
Could these hemorrhages have been caused by activities that Cloe Chandler was engaged in before death?
Sure.
Dr. Young, can you tell us what is depicted in State's Exhibit number 72?
State's Exhibit 72 shows the neck dissection, but it's a little bit more toward the right side. The sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is that broad muscle going down on one side, is on the lower part of the photo, or the mid portion lower part, and then the upper part has the strap muscles of the neck, which are located on the front of the neck. There are two white plastic arrows that are pointing out little small areas of hemorrhage.
And again, could these types of hemorrhages be caused by intubation?
Sure.
Could they be caused by other resuscitation attempts
Sure.
and potentially activities that Cloe Chandler was engaged in prior to her death?
Sure.
All right, Doctor, I'm going to draw your attention to State's Exhibit 75A. Can you tell the court what is depicted here?
State's Exhibit 75A shows a further dissection of the strap muscles in the neck, where the strap muscles are cut at the bottom and then basically pulled or reflected upward. The right sternocleidomastoid muscle is also cut at the bottom and reflected to the right. What can be seen in the center of the photograph is the thyroid gland, which lies below those strap muscles. There is a plastic white arrow on coming from the right side, or excuse me, the left side of the photograph, that is pointing to what appears to be a little tiny hemorrhage.
Now, is it possible, Doctor, that some of this hemorrhaging could be contributed to the process in autopsy as they reflect the muscles back?
It's possible.
And is it a possibility with regard to the apparent hemorrhage that is depicted in State's Exhibit 75A?
Sure.
Dr. Young, can you tell the court what is depicted in State's Exhibit 75B?
State's Exhibit 75B is a little hard to read because there are a lot of things that are blocking the view of the photograph. It appears that the thyroid cartilage is in the center of the photograph. There are white arrows that are coming from either side. It's not really clear what they're pointing to.
What is a diffuse hemorrhage?
Diffuse basically means it's over a broad area.
If the court received testimony that State's Exhibit 75B demonstrated diffuse hemorrhage, is that consistent with what you see here?
Well, it's hard to know. The photograph is shadowy, so it's not really clear if there is any kind of diffuse hemorrhage there. There could be nothing.
As far as diffuse hemorrhages, generally speaking, are those common in hangings?
Commonly in hangings, you could either see no hemorrhage, or you could see certain kinds of hemorrhages that are kind of like these, that basically are in soft tissue, that may be associated with some of these deep scalp hemorrhages, that may be associated with asphyxia, that may be associated with just congestion of blood vessels, that may be consistent with a wide variety of things. It's also possible that in natural deaths in which there is no evidence of any neck activity, it's possible to even see hemorrhages in the soft tissues of the neck and muscles, and deep scalp hemorrhages, even though it may be a natural death.
So in those circumstances, there would not be any object or force or action you could point to other than the process of dying. Sometimes in natural deaths, these hemorrhages occur, correct?
Correct.
Dr. Young, this is State's Exhibit number 76. Can you tell us what you see here?
State's Exhibit 76 is a dissected neck. The sternocleidomastoid muscles can be seen on the bottom and the upper part of the photograph as they have been reflected back. What is absent from the photograph are the neck organs themselves, which include the thyroid cartilage, the larynx, the trachea, all the strap muscles. These have already been previously removed. What can be seen are some of the deeper muscles in the neck structures, basically posterior muscles, and also the precervical fascia hemorrhage. Precervical fascia, which is basically the filmy fibers covering over the cervical spine. You can see individual white cervical spine vertebral bodies.
Does your experience and the literature educate you about examining these types of injuries and taking into account injuries to the back of the neck as depicted here?
Okay, I'm not sure any injury is depicted here. There,
Okay.
Over on the left side of the photograph, there are some areas that are darker that may be hemorrhage, but it's not clear if during the process of dissection that some of that is basically artifactually formed. This photograph here is really not all that impressive for injury. However, one of the things that's mentioned in the literature is that when evaluating a death in which there is some kind of neck throttling or strangulation or whatever, that to find hemorrhages in posterior structures such as precervical fascia hemorrhage or things further in the back are frequently artifacts, because there are a lot of veins that are passing in those structures there, and they can basically artifactually leak prior to or during the autopsy. But I'm not really seeing that here.
And just so the court's clear, the literature actually tells you that that those injuries towards the back part of the neck is something that you need to watch out for as being something that's often consistent with an autopsy artifact?
Yes.
And Dr. Young, can you tell us what is depicted in State's Exhibit number 77?
State's Exhibit number 77, although it looks a little mangled up, frankly, appears to be the right side of the thyroid cartilage, which has a lot of attached soft tissue. I think there is a thyroid horn that can be seen in the upper center portion of the photograph. A thyroid horn are basically these projections that are directed upwardly and posteriorly from the thyroid cartilage on both sides.
Do you see any evidence of fracture in State's Exhibit number 77?
No.
Is that relevant to your analysis?
One of the things that are frequently pointed out for manual strangulation or ligature strangulation deaths is that you frequently fracture thyroid horns, or possibly even the C-shaped bone that's above the thyroid cartilage. And frequently, if this occurred basically during the strangulation attempt, there would be hemorrhage associated with the fracture. Okay, the autopsy doesn't describe any fractures of any of these structures, nor is there a hemorrhage associated with a fracture that wasn't present.
Dr. Young, can you tell us what is depicted in State's Exhibit number 78?
State's Exhibit 78 looks also like they are the neck organs. It's showing a little bit more of the back portion of the thyroid cartilage. You can see the epiglottis there toward the right side of the structure, and there's also appears to be a little hemorrhage in some of the muscle there on the back left side. Once again, this is a posterior structure, and so these kinds of hemorrhages have to be interpreted very, very carefully.
I'm sorry, can you say that last part again? I had a hard time.
This is a posterior structure, and you have to interpret those kinds of soft tissue hemorrhages very, very carefully and conservatively, because they are often artifact.
State's Exhibit number 75A, what is depicted?
State's Exhibit
79A,
79A shows the larynx and the upper portion of the trachea. There has basically been scissors that have been inserted and have cut the backside of the larynx and the trachea to expose the laryngeal mucosa. In the upper part of the photograph there are the vocal folds and little ventricles that basically form the voice box. Below that, the mucosa shows vertically oriented streak-like small hemorrhages in the mucosa.
Are those hemorrhages indicative of anything?
Okay, what it's indicative of is not something that I'm entirely clear. Is you mean consistent with something or nothing, or
Here,
what
let
do you
me
mean?
strike that. Is finding hemorrhage in this area of the larynx nonspecific?
It is frequently nonspecific. It's possible to see those kinds of hemorrhages for a wide variety of reasons, or perhaps even for no apparent reason at all.
Could these types of hemorrhages been caused by intubation?
Sure. What frequently happens with intubation is that the tip of the endotracheal tube passes below the glottic folds, which are on the upper part of the photograph, and then a bulb is inflated so that it can prevent anything from being inhaled past that bulb. So right where those hemorrhages are, frequently where you're going to see the endotracheal tube bulb inflated.
So is it accurate to say that those hemorrhages could have been caused by the endotracheal tube itself?
Yes.
And they could have also been caused by the expanding cuff when that is inflated?
Sure.
Moving on, Doctor, to State's Exhibit 79B. Can you tell the court what is depicted here?
It looks like there are incisions that have been made into the mucosa right from that lower glottic fold on both sides.
And do you see any evidence of injury in this photograph?
Well, there's some darker areas. I'm not sure if those are areas of hemorrhage or if they are nothing at all. It's not really clear. This is an unusual kind of procedure to do.
And if what you do see is in fact injury, would those injuries be nonspecific?
Well, they may not even be injuries.
Okay. Are we still discussing generally the area where intubation could potentially cause injury?
Sure.
State's Exhibit 80, what are we looking at here, Doctor?
It looks like we're looking at a posterior neck dissection, which basically means it's down the back side of the neck. And there are some muscles there in the backside that are being reflected upward. And you can see the vertebral processes there in the center and the mid portion there that are covered by soft tissue and ligamentous tissue. There are two plastic arrows. One of them appears to be pointing to a small dark area that might either be a hemorrhage or a shadow. It's hard to tell from this photograph. The other plastic arrow looks like it's being burrowed into the soft tissue, and it's not really clear what it's showing.
And you had mentioned this appears to be a dissection of the back portion of the neck.
Yes.
And your testimony earlier, would that also apply to the area that you're seeing in Exhibit 80, wherein you testified that the back of the neck is common for autopsy artifacts to manifest here?
What I said before mostly happens to do with structures that are deep within the neck from a front dissection. It is possible, however, to get artifactual hemorrhages in the back side of the neck, even from livor mortis. Okay, this sort of thing is really not indicative necessarily of any trauma.
And livor mortis would be part of the natural dying process, correct?
It's a frequent change in the dead body where basically the blood pools with gravity toward the back side of the neck.
Doctor, there was testimony in this case about the appearance of vomit at the crime scene, and that it's unusual to see vomit in a hanging victim. Is that accurate?
I don't think, I've never heard of such an observation. Basically handling the body after death, it's not really called vomit really, because that's something that a living person will do. But sometimes contents in the stomach basically can come out of the nose and the mouth when the body is being moved or handled in any kind of fashion. That happens.
If in this case, the facts demonstrate that at some point after Chloe's death, her body was manipulated not only by Kelsie Thomas in trying to find out what the problem is, but also by EMT workers performing life-saving measures, would those circumstances cause somebody who has passed to emanate vomit from their body?
Well, it's not vomit, it's basically stuff in the stomach.
Sure.
The answer is yes.
The court also received testimony regarding Cloe Chandler's weight and how, given Cloe Chandler's weight, it would be surprising to find the ligature marks as pronounced as they were in this case. Is that an assertion that you would agree with?
I don't agree with that.
And why not?
I think a child who's about 45 pounds, which is what I understand, that's sufficient weight to be able to cause those kinds of abrasions. One of the things that also happens with abrasions on a dead person is that they get dried out, and they can also look much more distinct at a later time than they might initially. The abrasion I'm referring is to that right side. Many of the changes there in the front of the neck are more like erythema, and that you can get erythema from even small kinds of trauma. What I'm trying to say is those particular findings in the neck could be made on a child who's 45 pounds.
Dr. Young, the court has received testimony in this case that there is more injury than would be expected to be seen in a hanging, particularly in a child hanging, considering she would also expect to lose consciousness within 3 to 10 seconds. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with it.
And why not?
That particular statement in this particular case assumes a great deal. The fact is that what the child was doing prior to her being found hanging in the closet is unknown. We don't know what she was doing. We don't know exactly what she was involved in. We don't know what she was fiddling with. We just don't know. So making certain kinds of statements as to how long it took for her to become unconscious and other kinds of things like that are speculative and assumed.
If the suspension, and we do have evidence of suspension in this case, correct?
Sure.
And primarily the upwardly canted litigation furrows?
Yes.
In a case of suspension, that suspension could be either full or partial, correct?
Sure.
If this were in fact a partial suspension, is it accurate to say that the pressure would be intermittent and therefore a person would not lose consciousness as quickly as if the pressure was consistent?
A lot of this is speculative. I'm not sure that I could answer those with a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
I understand. In hanging deaths, Dr. Young, is partial suspension common?
Yes,
Is it more common than a full suspension?
I believe it is.
Based on your observations and expertise, doctor, would you have any way to determine whether or not this would have been a full or partial suspension?
Just from what I've seen, no.
In this particular case, there were measurements conducted, and ultimately law enforcement took issue with the possibility that Chloe, given her height and the height of the dowel rod, may have been able to reach the ground. Were the injuries that you observed in your analysis consistent with a partial suspension?
Sure.
The court received testimony that because the ligature was soft and because the child was light, finding internal injury in Chloe's neck would be surprising in a hanging death. Do you agree with that?
No.
And why not?
Because under the circumstances here, considering the ligature, considering everything, the finding of abrasions and the erythema like are present in this case is all consistent. This is not something where finding these things in this particular case is all that remarkable, really.
Does the fact that the ligature was light mean anything as far as leaving a mark?
The ligature was what?
Was light or padded or soft?
My understanding is that these are garments, right?
Correct.
Okay, well, something that's soft, I mean, it's not like cotton candy, all right? But something like pajama bottoms are capable of causing those kinds of marks under this kind of circumstance.
Dr. Young, if the court received testimony that it would be unusual to see any internal injury of a hanging death, particularly of a child, would you disagree with that?
Are we talking about this particular case or in general?
Well, the court has received testimony that it would be unusual to see injury in a hanging death, particularly in a child hanging death, and I'm just asking if that's something that you would agree with.
In this case, I don't agree with it. This is not, the circumstances here is that the child is found suspended, and then the child is handled frantically to resuscitate the child, and is even further intubated and handled in a fashion to somehow help or save this child. This is not simply only hanging that's involved here. There are a lot of things that are involved. And so to make some kind of a general statement like this doesn't really apply to the specifics of this situation.
Now, you had mentioned intubation. In this case, the medical records demonstrate that Cloe Chandler had been intubated twice. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Does the fact that Cloe Chandler was intubated twice mean anything to you?
It just double the opportunity to get some of these injuries.
Would it, I guess I'm asking from a layperson's perspective, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, would intubating
and even what is common, but using it to apply it to a specific case with specific circumstances, even though it may guide your thinking, you can't just directly take some literature article and apply it directly to this specific circumstance when the case report may be completely different circumstances.
What would a forensic pathologist expect to see on internal examination in cases of manual strangulation?
What is commonly described in the literature under manual strangulation is that because it is such a violent event, you see a lot of violence. There's quite a bit of associated head injury in the form of bruises and lacerations and fractures and other kinds of injuries there in the face. Because a person who is struggling against being strangled, the usual approach is to try to remove whatever the strangling agent is. So frequently there may be scratch marks that are made in the neck. In a manual strangulation, you frequently don't see any ligature furrow at all. You just basically see a lot of scratches and some bruises. In a ligature strangulation, you may see the marks of the ligature, but you'll also see a lot of the violent activity or evidence of the violent activity that is associated with strangulation. Strangulation is a violent act, and it's usually the person is doing their level best to keep from dying from it. And so the more the person struggles, the more findings and injuries that you see in the face and the neck. Frequently there are also petechial hemorrhages. They're not necessarily associated with a lack of oxygen, but just the general trauma of the whole event can cause small blood vessels to rupture. A lot of times these petechiae may be in the eyes, in the conjunctiva, and sometimes those petechiae may be rather large. Internally, there may be hemorrhages in association with fractures of certain kinds of structures, including the C-shaped bone above the thyroid cartilage and also some of the posterior horns that are coming out of the thyroid cartilage. If there's hemorrhage, they're frequently in association with the areas of fracture, indicating that there was some kind of blood pressure going on at the time that those fractures were formed. Finding little scattered hemorrhages here in the neck in soft tissues is nonspecific, and that's recognized as well.
Now, you had mentioned you would frequently find scratches around the ligature, and we had observed early on in the slideshow that we went through some marks on Cloe Chandler's neck that were faint that you said could possibly be fingernail marks, correct?
Sure.
Would you expect those to be much more prominent in a manual strangulation?
Well, the problem here is talking about manual strangulation in general. If a person is unconscious and they're not struggling, then it's possible to strangle somebody like that and not leave any injuries. Frequently, the injuries basically occur when somebody is resisting a struggle, and that's where you see a lot of these things. These particular photographs in this particular case, they don't have that kind of struggle type of flavor to them at all.
And just to quickly follow up on one of those initial slides that we looked at with the areas of power, is it possible that in a hanging situation those marks could have been caused by Cloe Chandler reaching up and attempting to remove the ligature?
Sure.
In the absence of bony fractures or cartilage fractures, as a forensic pathologist, what does it mean when you see hemorrhages consistent with Cloe Chandler in the neck, the way that we have?
They're not specific. I've seen cases even in natural deaths where there's even a lot more hemorrhage than what was seen in the Cloe Chandler autopsy. It's just soft tissue hemorrhages like that. One has to be very careful in how to interpret something like that, not overcall things or claim things about it, that because they show up in a wide variety of situations, many situations not even involving trauma.
If the court received testimony that while several of these apparent injuries are nonspecific, but it's in fact the constellation of all of the injuries that informs Dr. Cavalier's opinion that this was a manual strangulation, do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that.
And I believe you just said it, but again, why not?
Basically, if the theory is formed from findings at an autopsy, which the strangulation thing appears to be that kind of thing, then you would expect all of the findings to be consistent with that theory. Otherwise, that theory wouldn't be as it is. So using that kind of claim that everything supports a theory is kind of a dangerous sort of circular argument problem.
And likewise, in your experience, you've observed more frequency of hemorrhages in natural deaths that you've autopsied as compared to Cloe Chandler?
Okay, I've seen many autopsies here. Thing is that if you're just looking as you're doing the casework, and you're looking at all the natural deaths that you're looking at, and you're looking at a wide variety of cases, in which you basically have the habit of leaving the neck organs to the end when you're doing the autopsy. Finding hemorrhages in neck soft tissues like this, I've seen cases which had no evidence of trauma or outside of the context of trauma, in which there are lots of deep scalp hemorrhages and even neck hemorrhages. It can happen.
Based on your review of the history of the case, were there other things in the history that could account for the hemorrhages that you observed on Cloe Chandler's neck?
Nothing's coming to mind.
In the history, Dr. Young, you're aware that EMT workers performed life-saving measures on Cloe Chandler, correct?
Yes.
And there was a notation there about, at one point, Cloe Chandler's skin appearing blue and then becoming more pink.
I believe that there was a notation in a pre-hospital incident report written by that witness, in which he said something like that.
Is there any significance to that in your analysis?
Having the tissue basically change color like that would indicate some kind of circulating blood. And in a situation in which there's a lot of frantic handling of the child, it could be one more reason why there might be soft tissue hemorrhages.
And in addition, we also talked about innovation being a potential cause for the injuries to the larynx that we observed earlier, correct?
Sure.
And Dr. Young, aside from your own broad experience in the field of forensic pathology, are there any textbooks or specific literature that you rely on in doing your work?
Well, there are textbooks that I've read over the years and that I read.
Is Dr. Cavalier's opinion finding manual strangulation consistent with the medical literature that you're familiar with?
No.
And why not?
I just previously described some of the situations and the kinds of things that are described under strangulation. This case doesn't have those.
Would it be accurate to say that this particular case lacks a lot of the classic descriptors of strangulation that you find in the literature that you rely on?
I say that that was fair.
What is your opinion about the hemorrhages in the neck of Cloe Chandler?
That they're there.
Are you aware of any specific causation?
No. This would be something that we would put under the category of non-specific.
There could be many causes for these specific hemorrhages?
Yes.
Does the presence of petechiae or lack of petechiae in this case demonstrate anything to you?
In a real strangulation case, petechiae are common. The lack of petechial hemorrhages is disturbing for it being a strangulation case in which there's a big struggle. Now, once again, if a person is not struggling or if they're unconscious, it doesn't take much force at all to basically strangle somebody like that, in which case you don't see all the findings. But if there is the typical type of thing in which these descriptors of strangulation are present at autopsy, you'd expect you see more frequently, I shouldn't say expect, you see more frequently conjunctival petechiae at least.
We heard testimony specifically about petechiae in the visceral plethora of the lung and the laryngeal mucosa. Are those findings also nonspecific?
They are nonspecific.
Does there have to be violence associated with those particular findings?
No. In fact, those kinds of findings, particularly those pleural petechiae, can be seen in sudden unexpected infant deaths.
So in natural deaths?
Pardon me?
So in natural deaths they can be found?
Yeah, correct.
There is a canting of the abrasion that goes upward and behind the ear, more predominant on one side than the other, but existing on both sides. Is that typical of a strangulation?
No, it's not. Particularly not a manual strangulation.
Do you typically find evidence of suspension in cases of manual strangulation?
Typically not.
Now, Dr. Young, you may not be aware, prior to today there was some discussion about Cloe Chandler having von Willebrand's disease, and the court has received testimony that that may have been a misdiagnosis. If Cloe Chandler in fact did not have von Willebrand's disease, does that impact your opinion in any way?
No.
And would it be fair to sort of summarize what we've been discussing here, that all of those soft tissue hemorrhages found in the neck can be seen in a wide variety of conditions,
Yes.
including natural death?
Yes.
May I approach your arm?
Okay.
Dr. Young, I would like to take out State's Exhibit number 86, and so if you can just go ahead and put some gloves on. And Doctor, can you take out the article? And so for purposes of identification, Doctor, there appears to be some buccal swabs and some children's pajama pants. Is that a fair observation?
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to examine this garment previously?
Yes.
Would you agree with Dr. Cavalier that those pajama pants were not consistent with the ligature marks that were found on Chloe's neck because it provides a broad, soft, padded surface?
No.
And can you explain that to the court?
What I'm holding here is just basically child pajama bottoms. There is a waistband. There are seams down the legs. There's a seam in the crotch. There are a wide variety of situations in which this can basically form a 3/4 inch in diameter transverse mark on the neck. One of them is to have it in this particular situation. This is probably about 5/8 of an inch, which is a little bit less than 3/4. But even having something like this, which is basically stretched out and even maybe, which may or may not have been twisted in any way, could have certainly made some kind of a mark as well. Having the presence of seams as well, where these are items that are a little stiffer and that they project, could also make certain kinds of marks in the neck that would be narrower. So this particular kind of garment is capable of making those kinds of marks on the child's neck, in my opinion.
Thanks, sir. Dr. Young, if the court has received testimony that there would have had to been movement on that ligature but beyond the hanging itself to produce the physical findings that you observed, would you agree with that?
No,
And why not?
because whenever there's pressure applied by an object against the skin, that is sufficient to cause an abrasion. All that is required is just damage of the surface cells. It doesn't require rubbing to rub them off either. I've seen many situations there with hanging deaths, for instance, where there is basically a deep groove or an impression from the ligature, and it's frequent to see abraded skin, particularly in prominent portions of a rope, for instance, that are basically formed. So having abrasions in a ligature furrow is not unusual at all.
And Dr. Young, you also received and reviewed crime scene photos for your case review, is that correct?
Yes.
And Dr. Young, I'm going to go ahead and display for you now Defense Exhibit P, which has been previously admitted, which is a crime scene photograph of those same pajama pants on Cloe Chandler's bed. Do you recognize this photograph?
Yes.
And if we look further to Defense Exhibit A2, that also depicts the pajama pants bottoms. Are these photographs that you examined as part of your review?
Yes.
And can you tell the court what you're seeing in Defense Exhibit A2 that may have informed your opinion at all?
Just basically the leg portions of the pajama bottoms. It's basically the same kind of pajama bottom as I just handled here and I looked at in the courtroom.
Do those pajama pants appear to be stretched or bunched in any way that you observed?
Not particularly, no.
Dr. Young, can you, I guess, summarize for the court the findings that you observed that would support a medical opinion that this was a hanging?
Okay, what I will represent to the court with a reasonable degree of medical certainty is that the accounts of eyewitnesses are consistent with the findings at the autopsy. And the accounts of eyewitnesses indicate finding the child basically being suspended there in the closet in a hanging fashion, and then the child resuscitated, or an attempted resuscitation being made. As such, if I were to offer a cause of death in this case, the cause of death would be hanging.
Now, Dr. Young, if in this case the medical examiner conducted the autopsy, shared her findings with investigators, investigators then told Kelsie Thomas how her story needed to match those findings, and then the medical examiner then reviewed transcripts of those conversations and determined that Kelsie Thomas's final story matched her findings. Do you find that problematic in any way?
Objection, leading, lack of foundation, lack of expertise as to this issue.
Dr. Young, do you find Dr. Cavalier's overall opinion problematic?
Yes.
In what way?
There's no account of a manual strangulation here. Okay, and it's not even clear here from the her second confession of anything here that really makes any sort of sense for manual strangulation. It doesn't fit.
Would you agree, Doctor, as you understand this case, that Dr. Cavalier, in rendering her opinion, is essentially accepting her premise as the conclusion?
Yes.
And why is that?
This is in context here with a confession of strangulation, a second account that is offered here. It basically, Dr. Cavalier says that this is a strangulation, and then law enforcement investigators basically say, bring up the element of strangulation into the whole thing, into the mix, and then basically continue at it until basically she agrees with Dr. Cavalier's findings. That's essentially accepting what the premise is as a conclusion. It's a circular argument. Dr. Cavalier, by calling this a strangulation off the bat, essentially contaminates a second interview here with the person introducing the element of strangulation into the whole mix, when such a thing was not even spontaneously offered by any witness.
Now, to contrast, Dr. Young, we had talked about the hemorrhages that were observed in the larynx. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
And we're also aware through the history of the case that Cloe Chandler was intubated, correct?
Yes.
You're not interjecting intubation as a possibility. That's a known fact, correct?
Well, it's represented to me as a fact that she was intubated.
Whereas opposed to strangulation would be a theory.
That's a theory.
So would it be accurate to say, Dr. Young, and that given your analysis of this case, you're quantifying known factors with other known factors and not quantifying known factors with unknown factors?
That is fair. If you're comparing witness accounts to physical evidence for fit, you're basically comparing items that exist outside of your own imagination, items that are objective and observable or factual. A fact is something that's observed. Okay. On the other hand, if you're doing like Dr. Cavalier, you're taking your autopsy findings and you're inventing a theory, something that's not observed. Okay, and that ends up, if you are concluding what you're theorizing, then that's a circular argument.
No further questions, Doctor.
We'll take a break and resume at 11 o'clock by the clock on the wall.